business meeting to vote on 2 nominations, but postponed from the Tuesday of this week, and 24 bills. The 2 nominations are Ms. Laura Daniel Davis to be the Assistant Secretary of Interior for Land and Minerals Management, and Ms. Sarah Bronin to be Chair of the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation. I'd like to take a moment to say a few words about some of the bills on the agenda today, starting with Senator Ernst's legislation to cite the Global War on Terrorism Memorial on the Reserve, which is essentially the National Mall. I was an original co-sponsor of the legislation to authorize construction. I think many of us were, of this important memorial 4 years ago, and have always maintained my strong support of a memorial to honor the men and women of the armed forces who have served our nation in global war on terrorism, our country's longest military conflict. The bill before us today waives a provision in the Commemorative Works Act that prohibits new memorials from being cited in the reserve. As there have been several proposals to waive the prohibition for new memorials or museums in that area on the mall, I believe it's important that this committee consider and affirmatively decide to waive the law. So I committed to my friend from Iowa that we would put it on the next legislative agenda, and I'm pleased that we have reached an agreement that will ensure the memorial is cited in an appropriate location within the reserve while still being subject to approval process that applies to all memorials. It is my hope that this memorial will be built as quickly as possible. We will also be considering an original bill to reauthorize 36 national heritage areas. 2 of these areas are in West Virginia, our National Coal Heritage Area and Wheeling National Heritage Area. This authorization will allow these areas significant contributions to our nation's continued and to provide an economic boost to the communities around them. So I'm pleased to have worked with Senator Brasso and our many colleagues who have introduced legislation to extend heritage areas in their areas and their states on this comprehensive authorization extension. These are just 2 of the 24 bills that are on the short list today, representing priorities of several members both on and off the committee. I'm glad that we were able to work through the majority of these bills today, and I want to thank both of the staffs on the Energy Committee for working diligently with all of you and all of your staffs and those who had concerns. So I want to thank them, and let me turn over to my Ranking Member, Mr. Brasso, Senator Brasso, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today we will consider the nominations of Ms. Laura Daniel Davis and Ms. Sarah Bronin, and I strongly oppose the nomination of Ms. Daniel Davis to serve as the Assistant Secretary of Land and Minerals Management at the Department of Interior. Under Ms. Daniel Davis' supervision, Interior rescinded previously issued grazing permits and imposed an oil and gas leasing moratorium on federal lands. Under her direction, the Bureau of Land Management has undermined our nation's energy and our mineral security. In October, the Bureau imposed a moratorium on federal nickel and copper mining leases in Minnesota. The Bureau is locking up the largest undeveloped known nickel and copper deposit in the world. One of the planned mining projects would produce enough minerals to build 250,000 electric vehicle batteries. At the end of last month, the Bureau made it more difficult to obtain drilling permits on existing oil and gas leases. It is also pressuring local BLM offices to give up even more decision-making authority to Washington. Ms. Daniel Davis' decisions are a gift to OPEC, to Russia, and to China. I encourage all members of our committee to vote against her nomination. We will also consider Ms. Bronin. As I stated at our markup earlier this month, I cannot support her nomination. Included in the markup are also 3 bills I oppose. They will limit our nation's access to important energy and mineral resources. In agreement with the chairman, we will have recorded votes on these specific bills. We are also going to mark up today a number of important bipartisan bills that I do support. I'm in agreement with the chairman. We will consider 22 bills by voice vote. These pieces of legislation carry a range of public land issues, from reauthorizing national heritage areas to protecting national historic sites. We also have bills to recognize the men and women who have served in our armed forces, including those who received the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration. I'm pleased to have introduced, along with Chairman Manchin, legislation to reauthorize a series of national heritage areas across the nation. This bipartisan legislation includes numerous bills to promote tourism and educational activities in these heritage areas. We will also consider legislation I introduced with Senator Bennett of Colorado, called the Ski Hill Resources for Economic Development Act, or the SHRED Act. This legislation will invest in outdoor recreation in mountain communities like those in Wyoming and in Colorado. The SHRED Act does this by ensuring national forests retain a portion of the annual fees generated by ski areas operating within their boundaries. These retained fees will be used on projects to improve recreation management, protect our forests, and support local economies. Wyoming is home of the world-class skiing. Our ski resorts are critical to our local economies. Right now, Wyoming ski communities are sending money to Washington but not receiving full benefits for these fees. The SHRED Act will help make the Forest Service a better partner, and I thank Senators Cortez Masto, Daines, Hickenlooper, Kelly, Risch, and Wyden on this committee for co-sponsoring this important legislation. I'd also like to highlight legislation introduced by Senator Ernst to establish a global war on terrorism memorial in the National Mall. I support this legislation, which is so important to the men and women of our armed forces as well as their families. We should recognize the heroic contributions of these men and women, especially those who gave the ultimate sacrifice to protect our nation from the threat of terrorism. In particular, I'd like to recognize the service and sacrifice of Marine Lance Corporal Riley McCullum. He was killed in a suicide bombing while guarding a gate at Kabul, Afghanistan airport during the final hours of the U.S. botched evacuation from that country. Whether serving in Iraq or Afghanistan or at home, these men and women have kept and are keeping our nation safe and from terror. Let's honor their service by supporting this important legislation and urge a swift passage by the full Senate. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to continuing to work cooperatively with you in a bipartisan way to advance the legislative priorities that we share. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Brasso. And now we're going to begin the consideration of our agenda. We will turn to the legislation on the short list circulated to the members last evening for today's business meeting. As I said before, there are 24 agenda items on the short list. Now, I understand the roll call votes have been requested on 3 of the agenda items, number 2, 8, and 18. But I believe we can agree to the remaining 21 agenda items by voice vote. But first, 15 of the bills on the short list may require an amendment. Amendments to 12 of these bills have been worked out by the joint staff, and I believe that we can adopt them in block by voice vote. They are amendments to agenda items number 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, 14, 16, 22, 23, 24, 27, and 28. They are listed with the agenda item they amend on the short list, and we circulated to the members last evening. In addition, Senator Lee has indicated he would like to offer amendments to agenda items 2, 6, and 18, which have not been agreed to and may require roll call votes. The first amendment that we need to take up is not on the short list, but was circulated to members last evening. It is Senator Lee's amendment to agenda item 24S, item number 24. It'll be Senate Bill 2433, and I understand it has been cleared by the joint staff. However, it is drafted as a first-degree amendment to bill, to which there is also an amendment in the nature of a substituted pending. I would ask unanimous consent to modify the Lee amendment to amend the substitute, and the Lee amendment be agreed to. Is there any objection? If not, hearing none, the Lee amendment to the substitute of Senate Bill 2433 is agreed to. Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
It's not the first time.
If there is no objection, I believe we can now vote to adopt the other cleared amendments in block by voice vote. Hearing no objection, we will have a voice vote to adopt the cleared amendments in block, after which we will turn to the contested amendments. The question is on adopting the amendments to agenda items 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, 14, 16, 22, 23, 24, 27, and 28 in block. All in favor say aye. Opposed? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Amendments are adopted. Senator Lee, do you wish to be recognized to offer an amendment to agenda item number 6 on your H.R. 297?
Yeah, Mr.
Senator
Chairman,
Lee.
thank you. So let me talk about this amendment just briefly. H.R. 297 directs the Forest Service to conduct a study to determine the suitability and feasibility of establishing a national forest unit in the state of Hawaii. In so doing, the Forest Service is directed to identify available land within the study area that could be included in such a unit. The Secretary is explicitly directed to evaluate the willingness of the landowners to sell or transfer land in the study area to the Secretary. The Secretary would then submit a report to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, describing the results of the study and making any recommendations to the Secretary, any recommendations made by the Secretary. So my amendment would direct the Forest Service, while conducting that same study, to consider and report on any potential impacts on housing prices, housing affordability, or housing supply if any federal land were to eventually be acquired for a national forest unit. According to data compiled from Zillow, Hawaii currently has the highest housing prices in the nation, $77,762 is the median home value, and is experiencing a shortfall of affordable low-income housing. So this amendment would ensure that when Congress is evaluating whether to establish a new national forest unit, it should also weigh the potential impacts that action could have on the state's already restricted housing supply. So I hope that efforts like this can become standard practice for inclusion when this body debates and potentially advances studies that might result in increased federal land ownership, particularly in a place like this where there's already an acute problem. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Rono.
I thank my colleagues for caring about the cost of affordable housing in Hawaii, something that we are well aware of. And in this study that is being requested under this bill, there will be community input. And as I said, our community is well aware of the need for affordable housing. So, you know, I'd welcome working with my colleague to address the serious issue of affordable housing in my state, but this is not the bill in which to do that. This bill requires the Forest Service to study the potential for land in Hawaii to become part of the national forest system. It was not written to address the issue of affordable housing. This bill requires the Forest Service to take into consideration a number of factors when conducting their study, including, in fact, the willingness of landowners to sell or transfer lands under consideration. By the way, if the landowners wish to sell their land for housing, they can do so. It also requires the Forest Service to coordinate and consult with state, local, and other interested stakeholders while conducting this study so that community voices are considered. Mr. Chairman, I have not heard from any constituents raising concerns about this bill. I ask my colleagues to join me in opposing this amendment so that we can send this bill to the President and get the study underway. And I also want to add that the state of Hawaii is very supportive of the need to preserve our lands for future generations. This would be one of the ways that we would seek to do that, by undergoing a study of this sort. So I ask my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, ask for a roll call vote.
Thank you, Senator Lee.
I appreciate the insights offered by my friend and colleague, Senator from Hawaii. I understand that the purpose of the legislation is not one that deals with housing. It bears noting, though, that in this context you're talking about increasing the federal footprint and doing so in an area where there's a relative land scarcity. In addition to the fact that Hawaii is an island state, there's a relatively small landmass. It's beautiful, so a lot of people want to live there. It's small, and so when you increase the federal footprint, as this legislation contemplates and authorizes, when you're authorizing the federal government, the biggest landowner in America by far, the wealthiest entity in America by far, to go out and buy additional land, you tend inevitably, at least potentially, to further exacerbate the problem based on the scarcity of land there. And so I just think we ought to study this. I think it ought to be subject to some type of review before we do it. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to add, this is a bill that requests a study. We're not authorizing anything. And so it makes sense that before we engage in such authorization, that there should be a study with community input done. As I said, people of Hawaii are very well aware of the need for affordable housing, and I would welcome support from my colleague for that effort, and I do have some other bills that would do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Is there anyone else that wishes to be heard on the lead amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Senator
Just
Murkowski.
a question, and I don't know where this is directed, but when such a study is done, as Senator Hirono is attempting to do, is there not economic factors and considerations that go into the review of that?
Yes.
And would they help to address some of the concerns that Senator Lee has legitimately raised here in terms of impact on availability of housing? Can someone walk me through that?
This is the kind of study that will result in community input, and that the community will very much weigh in if they think that the lands under consideration would be more appropriately used for affordable housing.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator.
And if that's the case, I would certainly hope that such analysis would be conducted in all offense. If what we're suggesting, as I think has just been suggested, is that some kind of analysis like this might take place anyway, why not put it in there? Why not formalize it in the legislation? To say when the federal government's taking an action that will inevitably reduce the supply of land on any of the islands in the state of Hawaii, why not formalize this as part of the process?
Any input from Sam, you, or Matthew on this?
I would only add to what Senator Hirono said, that the bill already requires the contents of the study to include such considerations as whether the landowners are willing to sell, whether the land is suitable to be included in the National Forest System, the cost estimates for it, and whether there are other alternatives to including it in the National Forest System. So I think the bill as it is currently drafted is very broad and would allow for consideration of the sorts of things that Senator Murkowski was asking about.
Matthew?
While the bill would allow for those considerations, Senator Lee's amendment would specifically require that those considerations be undertaken. I think that's the difference.
That is the difference. Oh, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lee.
That is the difference, and those things should be taken into consideration. And one could argue the list of things that Sam mentioned on that list doesn't include this particular inquiry. One could argue that in undertaking some of those things, someone should, out of an abundance of caution and prudence, also take into account what happens given the supply-demand forces when you reduce the supply of available land to the price of housing. But it's not on that list. And if we're suggesting that it's implicitly on that list, then why not include it expressly?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hirono.
if we require this kind of an analysis, one could argue that any time any smidgen of land is used for any other purpose than for housing is going to add to the cost of housing. I should think that the people of Hawaii will weigh in, and as I said, they are well aware of the need for housing, but they're also very aware of there's also a goal to preserve our pristine environments and lands for other purposes. So I think it should be left to the people of Hawaii to make that assessment known. As I said, you put in this kind of requirement, and I would say that every study will say taking away land is going to somehow add to the cost of housing in Hawaii. I think that is really unnecessary.
The question is on adoption of the Lee Amendment to H.R. 297. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Manchin?
No.
Mr. Wyden? No. Ms. Cantwell? No. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Heinrich? No. Ms. Hirono? Mr. King? No. Ms. Cortez Masto?
No by proxy.
Mr. Kelly? Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Barrasso?
Aye.
Mr. Risch?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Mr. Daines? Ms. Murkowski? Mr. Hoban? Mr. Langford? Mr. Cassidy? Mrs. Hyde-Smith?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Marshall? On this vote, the ayes are 9 and the noes are 11.
Agree. The amendment is not agreed to. We'll go to our second agenda item from November 16th meeting is nomination of Sarah Bronin to chair the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Ms. Bronin is a Rhodes Scholar, a Yale Law School graduate, and both an architect and a lawyer. She is currently both a professor at Cornell's University, College of Architecture, and on the faculty of Cornell Law School. She has previously taught property law at the University of Connecticut Law School and was recently a visiting professor at Yale School of Architecture. She's clearly knowledgeable about issues of historic preservation, has a distinguished record of public service in this area at the state, national, and local levels. I think she's highly qualified to chair the Advisory Council, and I urge a favorable vote on her nomination. Does anybody wish to make any remarks on Ms. Bronin? If there's no further debate, the question is reporting nomination of Sarah Bronin to the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation with the recommendation that the nomination be confirmed. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Manchin?
Aye.
Mr. Wyden?
Aye.
Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Mr. King? Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Kelly? Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper? Aye. Mr. Barrasso?
No.
Mr. Risch?
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee?
No.
Mr. Daines? No. Ms. Murkowski? Mr. Hoban? Mr. Langford? No. Mr. Cassidy? Mrs. Hyde-Smith?
No by proxy.
Mr. Marshall? Excuse me, there's been a question as to how Mr. Hoban voted? And Mr. Cassidy? Aye. Okay. On this vote, the ayes are 12 and the noes are 8.
Nomination is favorably reported. Next, we have Senator Lee has indicated he has amendments to two other bills, agenda item number 2, which is Senate Bill 180, and agenda item number 18, which is Senate Bill 1589, for which roll call votes have been requested. I propose we defer consideration of those two amendments until we take up the bills for which roll call votes have been requested and proceed now to a voice vote on the 20 agenda items for which roll call votes have not been requested. Hearing no objection, the question is on favorably reporting agenda items 1 and 3, 7, 9, 1 and 3 through 7, 9, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17, 19, 22 through 28 and 30 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Senator. We want 1, 3, and 3 through 7. Yeah, 1, and then 3 through 7, not up to 22, 22 through 28, and then 30. I might have confused you on that. You did. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hirono.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the items that we're going to take up for a roll call vote is, a non-roll call vote, is item number 27 having to do with Prada.
Yes, that is correct.
So I would like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including Prada in this morning's agenda. And we have worked with you and with Senator Menendez's staff to come up with the appropriate amendments. There is one more change, small change, that I'd like to continue to work with you on this bill before this bill hits the floor, and I appreciate your willingness to do
We're
that.
happy to do that, and I think we worked with all the committees and everyone's in agreement. So all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed? Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Lee.
I'll send a list to the chairman with those on which I'd like to be recorded as a no.
Absolutely. No objection. Senator Lee has have a list here of his objections to be recorded. Now we'll move to the bills and amendments for which roll call votes have been requested. The first agenda item is item number 2, which is Senate Bill 180, Senator Heinrich's Buffalo Tract Bill. Senator Lee has indicated he has an amendment to Senate Bill 180. Senator Lee, do you wish to offer your amendment at this point?
Yes.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, would it be appropriate for me to just give an overview of the legislation, underlying legislation before we
Absolutely.
take
Senator Heinrich,
the
sorry.
Senator's amendment?
Senator Lee, you're next.
One, I just want to thank the chairman and the committee for moving forward on the Buffalo Tract Protection Act once again. This legislation would withdraw 4 small parcels of BLM land just north of Albuquerque in a residential setting from mineral development. The area to the north of this, the more rural area, already is home to several active gravel mines, but the local community is united in their opposition to new gravel mining on these particular tracts. This committee reported this bill on a voice vote in the last Congress. I'm very pleased to see it moving again. These BLM parcels act as a critical wildlife connection between the Sandia Mountains to the south and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the north. In addition, these lands are literally adjacent to people's backyards. This is a residential neighborhood right up against these tracts. They're also very important lands. There's a historic connection to 2 tribal governments and the local land grant. So the 2 neighboring tribal governments, the county, the local land grant, the nearest town, the local neighborhood associations, and the residents in these areas agree that this is just not an appropriate place for a gravel mine. A legislative withdrawal will permanently protect the wildlife habitat and the recreational and cultural resources for this community, and a vote for this bill, the underlying bill, is a vote for the Pueblo of Santa Ana, the Pueblo of San Felipe, the people of Placitas, the Merced Comunidad de San Antonio de las Huertas land grant, and everyone in this community who has worked so hard to craft this legislation for more than a decade now. And with that, I would just ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters from the Las Placitas Association and the Eastern Sandoval Citizens Association, the tribal government of the Pueblo of Santa Ana and the Pueblo of San Felipe, and the Merced de Comunidad de San Antonio de las Huertas land grant.
Without objection. Senator Lee, do you wish to offer your amendment at this point?
I do.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This legislation, as has been referenced by Senator Heinrich, would withdraw 4,300 acres from location, entry, and patent. Those acres are parcels that in this circumstance contain significant aggregate resources that are pretty critical to the development of homes, building generally, roads, bridges, and other public works, and are some of the only available aggregates in the Albuquerque area. If enacted, this legislation would end up significantly impacting the prices of available aggregate resources for the entire region, and this in turn would drive up the costs of constructing and repairing homes and a wide range of community infrastructure. It's my view that instead of taking this approach, Congress should provide opportunities for the community to determine together how most appropriately to use the land. So what my amendment would do would be to require the Secretary to authorize the transfer of the land in 3 ways. First, in order of priority, the land would be offered up for sale either to the state or to a unit of local government, and to offer it up at what I call a PILT ratioed price. As PILT is relative to the taxable value of the land, this PILT ratioed price would be relative to the appraised value of the land. This would make the land a feasible purchase for a local unit of government, which could then determine with all of its constituents how to best use the land in question. Second, the land would be made available for disposal under the Recreation and Public Purposes Act, which authorizes the sale or lease of public lands for recreational or other public purposes to states and local governments and to qualified nonprofit organizations. Examples of typical uses of RPPPA are campgrounds, schools, firehouses, hospitals, parks, fairgrounds, et cetera. Third, and lastly, the land would be made available for sale to public and private individuals at market rates. After giving state and local governments ample opportunity to acquire the land for their own purposes, the land would be offered for sale to others, but still allowing for community input through the relevant state and local organizations or zoning regulations to which the land would still be subject. Okay, I think this is something that would allow for the needs of the local community to be taken into account and to be addressed at the local level. And I thank you for your consideration and ask for your support.
Senator Heinrich.
I would be curious to know if the amendment has the support of any of the local community groups, the county, the local town of Bernalillo, the tribal governments nearby, or the neighborhood associations.
To my knowledge, none of them have seen this. This is my amendment. I don't know what their position would be.
Well, I would urge that we oppose the amendment so that we can support the approach that the local community has put together.
Are there any other senators who wish to be heard on Lee amendment?
Yeah,
Senator
Mr.
Brasso.
Chairman, yeah, I support the Lee Amendment, and I oppose this legislation because it would permanently lock up valuable aggregate resources that would be used in the construction and maintenance of roads, bridges, and other critical infrastructure. If we're serious about fixing our nation's highways and infrastructure, we must make the raw materials available. So I would urge my colleagues to join me in voting against this bill. And I want to enter into the record letters from the New Mexico Mining Association and the National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association, who are also opposing S-180.
Without objection. Any other
Mr. Chairman,
senators?
can I add one last thing before we vote?
Senator Heinrich,
I would just
absolutely.
say that we have a very large active gravel mine just to the north of this area. It's fine. It's, you know, it's doing its job. We have plenty of supply. This is not a, there's not a shortage of gravel. This is a situation where the aggregate in question would literally have to be developed in people's backyards.
If there's no further debate, the question on adopting the Lee Amendment, number to agenda item number 2, which is Senate Bill 180, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Manchin?
No.
Mr. Wyden?
No.
Ms. Cantwell? No. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Heinrich? No. Ms. Hirono? Mr. King? Ms. Cortez Masto? Mr. Kelly? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Barrasso?
Aye.
Mr. Risch?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Daines? No. Ms. Murkowski? No. Mr. Hoven? No. Mr. Langford? Mr. Cassidy? Mrs. Hyde-Smith?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Marshall? Excuse me, Mr. Cassidy, there seems to be some confusion on how you voted. Could you repeat your? for the amendment. Okay.
There were some hanging chads.
Then on this vote, the ayes are 7 and the noes are 13.
The amendment is not agreed to. We'll turn now to agenda item number 1 from our November 16th meeting is that of Mrs. Laura Daniel Davis to be the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Land and Minerals Management. Ms. Daniel Davis has served in the Department of the Interior before. She served as the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary of the Interior during the Clinton administration and as Chief of Staff to Secretary Salazar and to Secretary Jewell during the Obama administration. She has been serving as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Land and Mineral Management since January. She is plainly knowledgeable and experienced and up to the task for which she has been nominated, and I urge a favorable vote on her nomination. I support this nomination, and do you wish to make any more additional remarks? Senator Barrasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do like to say a few words before we vote on Ms. Daniel Davis. Since the start of the Biden administration, Ms. Daniel Davis has been doing everything she could to undermine American energy production. We saw it again last month. Look, Americans are paying the price for this. At the end of October, the Bureau of Land Management, which Ms. Daniel Davis oversees, took another step to make it even more difficult to produce oil and natural gas on federal lands. The Bureau argues that climate change justifies additional layers of red tape, which is probably why President Biden then goes and begs Vladimir Putin for more energy, because they're shutting it down in America. The Bureau fails to acknowledge that stopping oil and gas production on federal lands will have no impact. The Bureau acknowledges that stopping oil and gas production will have no impact on the world's total oil and gas production. Secretary Haaland admitted that this fact at her confirmation hearing in this very room. I've asked Secretary Haaland if she was, quote, aware of any evidence that suggested that a ban on oil and gas leasing on federal lands and waters is going to reduce the world's total production of oil and gas, and her answer is no. Mr. Chairman, stopping oil and gas leasing on federal lands and waters will do nothing to address climate change. It will make the United States more dependent on our adversaries like OPEC, the cartel, and Russia, and it's going to continue to make American energy more expensive. Americans are facing the highest rate of inflation in 30 years. We're facing the highest prices at the pump in 7 years, higher prices this winter to heat their homes. The last thing the American people now need are policies from this administration that's going to make American energy even more expensive. But that's where we're headed. This is what House Democrats are trying to do in their reckless tax and spending bill, and it's exactly what Ms. Daniel Davis will do if she is confirmed. I urge all of my colleagues to vote no on this nomination.
Any further comments?
Strong letter to follow.
Let me just say that our job here is to get the most competent people, qualified people that can do the job. She is doing basically the administration's work, and she's done it well in the past 2 administrations, and I would recommend a consideration for a favorable vote. With that, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Manchin.
Aye.
Mr. Wyden.
Aye.
Ms. Cantwell.
Aye.
Mr. Sanders.
Aye.
Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. King. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Barrasso.
No.
Mr. Risch.
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee.
No.
Mr. Daines. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Hoven.
No by proxy.
Mr. Langford. Mr. Cassidy.
No.
Thank you, Senator. You're dealing with an aging staff here, I'm afraid. I appreciate that. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
No by proxy.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Marshall. On this vote, the yeas are 10 and the nays are 10.
The committee being equally divided on this vote, it becomes my duty under Senate Resolution 27 to transmit a notice of the tie vote to the Secretary of Senate, after which the Majority Leader may make a motion to discharge the nomination, and if the motion is agreed to, place the nomination on the executive calendar. Now, we will vote on agenda item number 2, which Senate Bill 180. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I want to know if there's any other senators who wish to speak on this piece of legislation. If not, we could do this by a voice vote if you wish, unless someone wants a roll call. Voice vote, okay?
We'd like a roll call.
Roll call vote. Roll call vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Manchin.
Aye.
Mr. Wyden.
Aye.
Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. King. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Barrasso.
No.
Mr. Risch.
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee.
No.
Mr. Daines. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Hoven.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Langford. Mr. Cassidy. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
No by proxy.
Mr. Marshall. On this vote, the ayes are 13 and the noes are 7.
Motion is agreed to. We will now move to agenda item number 18, which is Senate Bill 1589, Senator Wyden's bill to designate BLM and Forest Service lands in Oregon. Senator Lee has filed an amendment to the bill. Senator Lee, do you wish to offer your amendment? I do. Senator Lee.
So when wilderness areas are designated, many recreational uses and, of course, most industrial uses of the land are prohibited. It's kind of the idea behind a wilderness designation. Similarly, when lands are withdrawn from location, entry, patent, and industrious uses like mineral extraction become prohibited. It's my view that Congress ought to be cautious when using its authority to prohibit these uses, as it can severely impact local economies. It's one thing for us to vote here on whether to do something, but it does have a very significant impact on communities far from us. In the specific case of this legislation, S 1589, which would expand a wilderness designation by about 59,000 acres and withdraw an unspecified amount of acreage from mineral entry, significant deposits of tellurium have been identified in the areas in question. Now, tellurium is considered a critical mineral. We've had a lot of talk about such minerals in this committee and in the Senate in general. Critical minerals are important. This one in particular is one that's used in alloys, in semiconductors, and in solar panels. All things that are in great demand right now and are likely to continue being in great demand. So as Congress considers a whole lot of proposals to increase the deployment of solar energy across the United States, Congress really ought to keep in mind that access to tellurium is going to be necessary. If it can't be sourced domestically, the United States will end up having to import tellurium or alter its plans of greater dependence on solar energy. And as we found, some of the countries from which we have to import critical minerals aren't always the countries that we want to be buying from or dependent upon. Furthermore, the wilderness areas and mineral withdrawals proposed in this bill have not, to my knowledge, garnered sufficient local support to justify this pretty significant action. In September of this year, the Josephine County Board of Commissioners sent a letter describing their express opposition to the proposed mineral withdrawal. Communities like these rely on the mandate in FLPMA to encourage the development of a stable domestic mineral industry. And this bill, of course, undermines that part of FLPMA's mandate. As the provisions of this bill relating to mineral withdrawals in wilderness areas could end up having significantly detrimental impact on domestic mining production and have failed to garner enough local support to justify them. I ask for your support on my amendment to strike those provisions of the bill. Thank you.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Notwithstanding the fact that my friend Senator Lee is going to be very unhappy Saturday evening when his Utes lose to the Oregon Ducks as the Ducks pursue a national championship, I must oppose the Lee Amendment. The Lee Amendment would gut, colleagues, the underlying legislation, the Oregon Recreation effort, which has passed this committee the previous 2 Congresses and is identical to legislation that Senator Murkowski and I painstakingly negotiated in 2019 and passed the committee. In particular, the wilderness expansion that Senator Lee seeks to terminate has been negotiated and renegotiated twice in the past 2 Congresses and does not include any lands within the harvest land base. Therefore, this would not impact any planned timber harvests in the area. Now, apropos of this question of local support, the mineral withdrawal has been in place since 2017 and is the result of over 44,000 public comments, of which 99% were in support. And I'll just close, colleagues, because I think every one of us that has been honored to serve on this committee understands that recreation is an increasingly powerful economic engine. It is a huge jobs multiplier, whether it's rafting and guiding companies or outfitters or paddle manufacturers or brewers or wineries. The list goes on and on. So I would just ask, and I thank my colleagues' indulgence because this is a busy morning, I would ask my colleagues to vote no on Senator Lee's amendment, yes on legislation which is identical to what we have passed on multiple occasions here in this committee, and I thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any other senators who wish to speak on the Lee Amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to support Senator Lee's amendment, which would help preserve access to and potential development of tellurium deposits in southwestern Oregon. This is a critical mineral. It's used to make solar panels. We need this, and I urge my colleagues to support the Lee amendment.
Any other further comments? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Manchin.
Aye. Oh, no. No, I'm sorry.
Later I, pal.
That's right. Follow Angus's lead.
Boy.
Mr. Wyden.
No.
Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. King.
You almost got me.
Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Barrasso.
Aye.
Mr. Risch.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee. Mr. Daines. Ms. Murkowski.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hoven.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Langford. Mr. Cassidy. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Marshall. On this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 12.
The amendment is not agreed to. Now I get a chance to vote aye on 18, Senate Bill 1589. I urge my colleagues to support the bill. Are there any other senators who wish to be heard on this bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Barrasso.
I oppose the bill because it permanently bans energy development and mining at a time when energy prices and inflation are soaring. This bill will also permanently restrict potential future land uses, including recreation, hunting, and forest management activities. Okay. Keeping America's energy and mining resources permanently in the ground and restricting future recreation is not the answer. So I would urge my colleagues to join me in voting no on this legislation.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be very brief, colleagues. Obviously, there are places to mine, but the source of clean drinking water for thousands of Oregonians where thousands and thousands of Oregonians have weighed in on behalf of this bill, shows the local support. I urge my colleagues to vote aye on final passage of the Oregon Recreation Act.
If there's no further debate on favorability of this bill, on agenda item 18,
Chairman?
Senator King.
I intend to support this bill. It's been carefully negotiated. It's gone through a long process, as Senator Wyden indicates, it's passed twice. I do think, however, that those of us who are interested in conservation, who are interested in dealing with climate change, have to face the fact that it's going to require more mining in the United States, and it's going to require more transmission lines. We can't have it both ways. There's no free lunch when it comes to energy. So I am going to support this bill, but I think this is an issue that the committee is going to have to discuss and come to grips with. Thank you.
Any further discussion? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Manchin.
Aye.
Mr. Wyden.
Aye.
Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. King. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Barrasso.
No.
Mr. Risch.
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee. Mr. Daines. Ms. Murkowski.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Hoven.
No by proxy.
Mr. Langford. Mr. Cassidy. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
No by proxy.
Mr. Marshall. On this vote, the ayes are 12 and the noes are 8.
The motion is agreed to. Now we will move to agenda item number 8, Senate Bill 609. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Are there any senators who wish to be heard on this bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. So Senate Bill 609, the Ruby Mountains Protection Act, it was brought before the ENR committee in the last Congress where it was approved on a bipartisan basis on a voice vote, but it did not receive consideration by the full Senate. The bill would prohibit oil and gas development within the Ruby Mountain area of the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest, which is located in Elko and White Pine counties in Nevada. It would also prohibit oil and gas development within the neighboring Ruby Lake National Wildlife Refuge, commonly referred to as the Ruby Marshes. This bill has bipartisan support as it is included as a provision within broader public land legislation in the House, sponsored by Congressman Mark Amodei. And this bill enjoys broad bipartisan support from local stakeholders and constituents. It's supported by the Timok Tribe, the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, the Nevada Conservation League, the Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, Patagonia, Friends of Nevada Wilderness, and the Sportsmen for the Rubies, a coalition of several hunting and fishing groups, including Trout Unlimited and the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and several other groups. I would ask my colleagues to vote yes on this legislation.
Any other senators wish to speak?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Barrasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure I oppose this legislation because it would permanently lock up land from federal oil and gas leasing and development at a time when energy prices are skyrocketing. We shouldn't be taking energy resources off the table when Americans are having to make a decision whether they can put food on the table or whether they can put energy in their homes to heat their homes and gas in their cars. Americans are being crushed right now by high gasoline and high heating home prices. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting against this legislation.
Any further comments? Roll call has been requested. If not, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Manchin.
Aye.
Mr. Wyden.
Aye.
Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Mr. Sanders. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. King. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Barrasso.
No.
Mr. Risch.
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee. Mr. Daines. Ms. Murkowski.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Hoven.
No by proxy.
Mr. Langford. Mr. Cassidy. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
No by proxy.
Mr. Marshall. On this vote, the ayes are 12 and the noes are 8.
The motion is agreed to.
I'll agree, I'll check that out, okay?
Senator Kelly?
Aye. Oh, a statement? Well, thank you. I thought we were going to go in order. I didn't think we were going to jump right to
That was one of the shortest statements we've had so far.
You what?
Are there any other senators wish to make a statement after Senator Kelly makes his statement?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to give everybody opportunity if they're going to leave, but thank you for holding this business meeting today. You know, today's agenda included several bills that I'm very proud to sponsor, including 1320, a bill to redesignate Chiricahua National Monument in Arizona as a full-fledged national park. This would be Arizona's 4th national park. And like Grand Canyon, Petrified Forests, and Saguaro National Park, it is a captivating natural and geological wonder. This bill is supported by a wide range of local governments and tourism organizations in southeast Arizona. They're excited for the visitors and the tourism revenue that'll come with this new park. In June, the National Park Service submitted testimony supporting the bill and responding to concerns raised by the neighboring San Carlos Apache tribe over access issues. I'm disheartened that in some parks there have been cases of tribal members being turned away when visiting cultural sites or gathering plants used in traditional ceremonies. One solution to this is better training for park employees on existing laws and policies that grant tribal members access to federal lands for such purposes. Mr. Chairman, this is an issue that I believe should be examined, and I would like to file additional views to the report for S-1320 that tribal members have access to national parks now and in future generations. The agenda also included my bill that would streamline improvements to the Visitor Center at Sunset Crater National Monument in Flagstaff. And we have a bill to authorize or reauthorize grants for the highly successful Yuma Crossing National Heritage Area. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this business meeting.
Without objection. First of all, let me just say this includes the business before the committee, and I want to thank all the senators for their patience and cooperation. We got an awful lot done today, and it's a great working committee, and thank both staffs for doing such a great job, Senator Brasso. With that, the committee stands adjourned.